afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be watching this. I am proud to say this could be one of the defining points in Scottish history on today's show. The hard work and dedication to uncovering ways for our country's freedom have now taken a positive course. I'm going to start by getting some people on to talk about what's just been happening. Sara Salyers, everybody knows you. Sara, we're on the cusp of something amazing today. We're going to the UN to establish that Scotland is a colony. Can you explain to the people the importance of this and what it means if we are successful?
I'll do my best. So the independence is actually something that doesn't happen at home. Independence happens when a country is recognized by its the international community as being an independent and sovereign state. So it doesn't much matter what happens here, because until Scotland is as a nation that the rest of the world recognizes as being entitled to operate on its own, independence doesn't go anywhere. So it's really important that we'd be in a position to get that recognition. Now, the next step, once you understand that, is most of us have heard British politicians talking about Scotland being a voluntary partner. I wonder if you've ever wondered why they talk about it so much. Well, the reason is that definition of Scotland within the Union is actually the big block to Scotland getting recognition as an independent state if it ever acts without permission of Westminster. What it's saying is that the UK, the state of the UK, was created by two nations coming together, dissolving the former kingdoms and states and creating a new state. And that is kind of like two parents, they have a child, well, they're not allowed to tear that child apart. It's like you have to have a negotiated divorce. But if that's not true, and it's not, by the way, and we can prove it, if they threw the treaty in the bin, which they did, and instead of creating this new state, they just annexed Scotland. They added Scotland to the English crown. They kept the English Parliament and abolished the Scottish Parliament, and they ran Scotland like a colony, all of which is true. Then we're not a voluntary partner, and there is no state that was created by these two partners. There's a kidnapping, there's England calling itself the UK, and Scotland as a colony. Now that means that there's no state to tear apart. And as a colony, a non-self-governing territory or dependency in UN speak, Scotland has the right to decide whether it wants to continue in that position or whether it wants to go it alone and get out from underneath this colonizing boot heel. It's a completely different situation. And also, if that is the case and it's recognized, then the Scottish people have the right to decide that without any interference, let alone asking permission from Westminster. So it's really, really important. It doesn't automatically deliver independence. What it delivers is the right and the route for Scots to decide for themselves.
Alf, you've written extensively on post-colonial theory and have identified many facets of how Scotland is a colony. What do you think us Scots need to understand about the relationship with England?
Well, as Sara says, there's a lot of deception going around about what the Union is and what it's not. What we know about colonialism is it's regarded by the United Nations as a scourge. That's a form of punishment on a people. And it's also a crime against humanity. So we have this situation where we are under the domination of another people, another culture, another government. And colonialism is relatively straightforward in its scientific definition. It's economic exploitation, which we have in Scotland. It's external political control, which we also have, and it may also involve or may not involve settler occupation. So the conditions for colonialism are here. The deception in colonialism, or what in post-colonial theory we call the colonial hoax, is where people believe that they are part of something greater, something bigger. And we have many, many people who believe there is a union. And Sarah's just explained that there is no union. And we can see the domination in the sense of the UN's criteria for self-determination, where an administrative power or a colonial power prevents the exercise of self-determination of other parts of its supposed union, in this case, the Scottish people nation. So we are held by force then, and colonialism is also regarded as force and geographic violence. So that's the situation we're in. And that's why, in a sense, we have to remember also that the political process has failed the people here in Scotland. We've had several nationalist majorities who have failed to deliver independence, although promising to do so each time they're elected. But this happens in post-colonial theory as well. We know the political process is difficult, and therefore the people have to consider other options. And the other straightforward option here, where most countries have become independent, is through the UN self-determination process.
John, if I can turn to you, by going down this route of going to the UN, proving that we have been colonised, will this mean that the indie establishment, for want of a better term, have been wasting their time trying to negotiate with Westminster?
Well, I could be quite critical of politicians, Norrie.
Yeah, go for it.
But you've got to look to the future. And, you know, we're on a route and we can't complete our journey without politicians. So I can be critical, but also constructive. Yes, they're wasting their time, politicians, pundits, and the movement in general, trying to persuade Westminster to allow something that they don't need to allow, right? We don't need permission. And as Sara said, there is no union. So my advice, my comment on politicians is, yeah, they can do some good stuff, but they're not doing what we need in terms of strategy and a constitution. My take on politicians currently, and some of them in the past, have been more focused on getting votes, delivering their party policies, and not looking at the long-term picture beyond the next election, and we've got one coming in 2026. So we need a mind shift, the same way that Salvo and Liberation have changed the minds and revealed the truth. And I think politicians need to accept the truth that we are revealing of Scotland's status and concentrate on what is deliverable constitutionally and internationally. The focus for our politicians and our pundits, fed by the media machine in the UK to a great extent, is the colonial story, the fiction that is the union. So we need a better focus. They're not wasting their time. They're wasting their time trying to tackle Westminster. We should change the approach.
Sara, Justice Pour Tout International are now on board to help. Can you tell us a bit about this organisation and explain to the viewers what happens next?
JPTI, Justice Pour Tout, Justice for All International, is an NGO. It's based in Geneva. And Geneva the UN at Geneva acts as a kind of hub for the UN in New York. So although they don't always talk to each other, there's a flow of information that way. And JPTI is specifically set up to advance and defend human rights, whether those are individuals or organizations or a section of a population or even a country. Their concern is the sort of basic human rights under international law, and of course the preservation of international law, which is particularly, current at the moment. That question of whether international law is going to hold. So they've, because they're based in Geneva and they're based at the UN, that means that gives us a footprint there. They have now been authorised to represent Liberation Scotland, and to take the case forward, and so we're working closely with them. And the thing that I think Sharoff, who heads international JPTI, would say is that what people need to bear very firmly in mind is that what we're doing here isn't fringe or radical or, in any way sort of left field. It's basic. We're talking about basic international law. We're talking about human rights. We're talking about something we are not only that we're entitled to do. It's not only lawful that we are doing this, but it's absolutely an entitlement that where human rights have been denied, there is a right, a fundamental right to reclaim those rights, to demand those rights. And that is what we're doing, absolutely legally and according to international law on human rights. So, it's makes absolute sense that our partners there would be a human rights organization.
Alf, do you think the political parties will be embarrassed into coming on side with Salvo in this campaign?
That's a good question, Norrie. I think going back to post-colonial theory, what that tells us is that the dominant national party in which the people have put all their faith into tends to be co-opted by the colonial power. It becomes, in effect, a colonial administration. That's partly due to the fear and the petrifaction, it's called in the theory, at the decisive moment to declare independence. And that was, we might go back to 2015 and the election of 56 out of 59 SNP MPs was probably the high point. But that was one of 6 or so successive nationalist majorities that have not been used essentially to push independence beyond number 10 Downing Street. And that includes, as Sara says, the United Nations door, which is always there for peoples in colonial situation. So yes, the dominant National Party takes the people up a blind alley. It lacks innovation. It depends on slogans like let's get rid of the Tories rather than independence. It creates the rupture in the movement, which is what we've seen. The movement has split. That's why Liberation has nearly 20,000 members and Salvo a lot as well. So, and these are all, most of us are ex-SNP members. So we're actually the campaigners, if you like, of independence movement have shifted alliance from the SNP, which according to Tommy Shepherd recently might have as many as 3,000 activists, really. So most of the activists and campaigners are in Liberation and Salvo. That's where we are now. And this means also, in going back to post-colonial theory, where you have the shift from an independence movement to a liberation movement. And this is where the people understand their situation in much more detail. We understand now it's a colonial situation. Scotland is exploited, it's dominated politically, economically, and culturally, and therefore we have to understand that. And that's why the door to open the path to liberation is through the United Nations, as Sara says, and that is the path we are currently following. It's the path the SNP should have followed. Michael Russell had the chance as Constitutional Secretary to knock on the UN's door, not 10 Downing Street's door. He forfeited that. He didn't realise. But this goes back to the fact that the dominant National Party, even their understanding of independence is rudimentary because they've never really done any detailed analysis of colonial society. They think they're in a kind of union and a political solution will prevail. But actually, the situation is more complex than that.
John, getting back to a referendum, a lot of people are worried that another referendum will be like 2014. It'll take us down a dead end. What are the benefits to going to the UN in this regard?
Well, the benefit of going to the UN demonstrates that the democratic process can work, right? Because the referendum was a democratic process, and some people have the perception that it led to a dead end. We're on a route. It's quite a long route. And with the UN involvement, it gives the confidence to people and to politicians that the different approach can work. It's worked in the past for many countries in the same situation that we're in. And the case that's being presented demonstrates that with evidence. And we need a better understanding, as Alf has pointed out, that our route involves much more than the political and democratic process. It's legal, it's political, and it's also diplomatic. And we have all elements of society and ordinary people, although I hesitate to call my two colleagues ordinary people. But that's what Salvo's and Liberation's strength lies in. We have great cross-section of society, and we need to pull together and demonstrate that to the UN. And the support that can come from the UN when they recognise our situation and acknowledge that we're a non-self-governing country and that we're correct to be listed for decolonisation, then with that comes the support and the recognition of other nations. Peacefully, legally, politically, and diplomatically, we move down a new route. And that's a real benefit of taking it onto the international stage.
So, John, just to follow up on that, the last referendum we thought was unfairly held. There was a kind of the Purdah rules and everything was broken. When we look at another referendum, how can we be safe in our minds that this is going to be a fair one?
Fairness will come by the fact that it will be supervised and under the auspices of the UN and not interfered with, and I use that term guardedly, by the UK. And I'm sure Alf, who has looked at the UN process and a referendum and comparison, may wish to add a bit more detail on the benefits of having supervision by the UN on that democratic process and not governed by the colonial power.
That's excellent. Sara, this could unearth to the world the biggest scam ever. At this point, do you think Westminster will cave in or, like a wounded animal, fight to the end?
I think the history of the British state tells you pretty much what it's likely to do. But this is quite something, even for the British state. You know, the phrase "perfidious Albion," I think it was coined by one of the French, possibly even Napoleon. But that it breaks its word, that it practices tricks on and lack of good faith on other nations is pretty well kent, really. But this is a big one, because what the Anglo-British state has done is kind of, I think it panicked. I think when the decolonisation programme began at the UN, I think there was a sense of panic. There were certainly questions. I've looked into this, and the questions being asked about, well, what's Scotland's status? And so they had to come up with something quick, and they did. And that's 1954 was published, the Royal Commission report on Scottish affairs, which, when you read it, it's the whole thing is meant to represent Scotland as a thriving and prosperous part of this state of the UK, and that's where you find that very first definition. Scotland is a nation and entered the union with England as a voluntary partner and not as a dependency. And that's very interesting. Dependency is the other UN word for colony. And nobody at home, nobody here was asking whether Scotland was a colony. So it was clearly produced for the international community. It was produced because of the decolonisation process, and it was produced to head off really any examination to see whether Scotland should be listed, or more accurately, whether the UK government should be, the word is transmitting the information that Scotland is a dependency to the Committee for Decolonisation. That was a lie, of course. And when you look into it, what the other side of this is, Scotland certainly the treaty never came into effect. Scotland was added, as I said, to the English crown, and the English Parliament continued, the Scottish did not. So much like Ireland. So we basically have Scotland turned into a colony rather than a partner. But what's really interesting is the United Kingdom, it is also describing itself and how it began. How did that state come into being? And it's supposed to have come into being, therefore, from a single constitutional event where these two countries came together. They brought about by this Treaty of Union that created a new state. It merged the two former kingdoms and created this new state called the United Kingdom. But it didn't, because what the treaty says about the two crowns, a single kingdom, which meant a single crown, and a single parliament, joined parliament, it never happened. What happened was that England continued and changed its name to Great Britain and then the United Kingdom of Great Britain. But constitutionally, it was exactly the same as it always had been. So, in fact, no new state came into existence. So the UK has been telling porcupines to the whole international community about how it was born, how it came into existence. That's all nonsense. All that happened was that England continued, changed its name, added Scotland as a colony, and then strutted about the world stage calling itself Great Britain and then the United Kingdom of Great Britain. This is big, that state doesn't exist. It's a fiction. It's a semantic fraud, and that is extraordinary. I think one of the things Sharaf said is that this is something that a lot of other states or state representatives are going to find fascinating, if not an opportunity to really heap scorn onto the UK. But it's also something that they'll just keep up as long and as hard as they can. There's a wonderful quote from Daniel Defoe's spy master, who became Queen Anne's first minister, a guy called Robert Harley. And he said, other nations, and I mean our allies, call us, I haven't got it word perfect, but call us perfidious. They say that since we have violated our treaty with Scotland, and we laugh at the idea of fundamental and inviolable articles of union, then it's small wonder if we treat other nations as we do. And he thought that was funny. The other countries say they're perfidious because they basically threw the treaty in the bin and just annexed Scotland. And I think that's, that state has never changed, and we can expect it to fight all the way. But I'm quite looking forward to exposing, it's out there now, but I'm quite looking forward to seeing the international reaction to the fact that, the state that is sitting on the UN Security Council and the state that is sitting on NATO, called the UK, doesn't actually exist.
Can I come back to you? Are we in danger of overlooking those who are very comfortable in Scotland 2025? They're content to speak English. It's an international language. They don't like bagpipes, etc. In other words, they don't feel colonised.
Yeah, well, that's part of the process. And we have to remember, Norrie, that colonialism is based on psychology. And the psychological process is very important to consider. It's not something that we've considered in the independence campaign at all, really, until now. But yes, there are groups within a colonial society which are mainly the bourgeoisie and elements of the proletariat become the most pampered elements of the native population. And they are culturally assimilated through things like colonial schools, and elite universities as well play a role. And they try to distance themselves as much culturally and linguistically from the mass of the population. So we see a very more Anglophone elite, meritocracy, and the working class Scots-speaking speakers mainly. And so then we get this development of what we know in Scotland as the cringe, the cultural cringe, which is a form of self-hatred, but its scientific term is internalized racism, or even appropriated racial oppression, where minority groups in different societies, where there's inequality and discrimination, socio-linguistic prejudice. This is all part of the process in a colonial society, where you see an elite adopting a different culture. It's called mimicking the colonizer. Mimicking the colonizer, and every native elite did it and still do to some extent. So that's what we have. That the remedy for this condition, the psychological condition that colonialism leaves people, requires a difficult treatment. The only remedy is liberation and self-recovery, according to post-colonial theory, self-recovery of native culture. And we have to remember that independence is regarded by post-colonial theorists as a struggle for a native culture, a fight for a national culture. And this was written about recently in the National by Professor Riach, who talked about the importance of culture. And I would reinforce that as well. Culture is fundamental to the liberation of a people, because the liberation of a people, the nationalist movement, is based on national consciousness, which is dependent on two key dimensions: national languages and national culture. And that's why these cultures and languages are ridiculed, oppressed by the colonial power. They're marginalized. The languages aren't taught, particularly the Scots language. It's regarded as invalid, as are those who speak it. And this is actually the racist element of colonialism, because colonialism, we have to remember, is based on racism and debasing the colonized people, making them inadequate, making them subordinate, and making them think themselves ungovernable by themselves, subordinate, subaltern, whatever, and dependent on another people, another culture, another ideology, another value, other countries' values. And in colonialism, of course, it's only the values of the colonizer that are sovereign. So we have to work on the psychological impacts of colonialism. And we have 300 years of colonialism. And that's a long-term colonialism, very much longer than many other countries.
Yeah, thanks, Alf. John, this is going to put Westminster on red alert, isn't it? How confident are you that we can get the message out there and prove our case?
Well, I'm pleased that you said red alert, because the last lot were the blue alert. Westminster Power is constantly on alert to suppress and maintain control over Scotland. And yes, I'm confident we can prove our case. How can we prove our case? Well, you've got to remember, liberation started with 100 people outside the Administrating Powers Office just off the High Street on the 1st of September 22, when we read out a proclamation. Here we are, approaching, as Alpha said, approaching 20,000 members. We've done the spade work. We've done the research. Well, I say we. Lots of people within the Salvo Liberation have done the research. We've now got a submission. That is jaw-dropping in terms of evidence. There's a document on the liberation.scot website, part of the package, showing all the colonial markers, all the evidence that shows that we are treated as a colony. There's also a document showing that we've exhausted the routes domestically. Again, it's full of evidence confirming the suppression of our right to self-determination. So I'm confident that we have the case, the technical, legal information there to impress on the rest of Scotland to support Scotland's case at the UN, and to convince diplomats, representatives, delegations at UN of our status and our case. It's not going to be an easy task, and there will be, as you say, interference or opposition by the Westminster administrating power. That's taken as red or blue or whatever colour the administrating power is at that point in time. We recognise the opposition, and we will peacefully and determinedly progress along that route. No doubt.
Sarah, if I can come to you, what can the people of Scotland now do to help push the case that we are a colonised nation? What can we do right now?
Well, I think in terms of what we can do at home, it's support what we're doing, support liberation. We're going to we're taking on the British state, which has inexhaustible resources, apparently. And we're just ordinary folk. We're none of us wealthy, none of us has a salary, none of us, most of us don't even bother to claim our expenses because we're trying to make sure there's enough in the kitty for what we're doing. So, we could do with people getting as many of their friends and neighbours as they possibly can to sign the Edinburgh Proclamation, sign up and become a Liberation member. It doesn't cost you a thing. You don't have to do anything either. If you want to get active, you join Salvo. Salvo's the campaign arm of Liberation. And we've got 11 hubs across Scotland. I think it's coming up, it's between 7,000 and 8,000 people now. We would call activists, boots on the ground. And if you want to be part of that, you join Salvo. All Salvo members are Liberation members. And get as many people. Let's show the UN that Scotland wants to be decolonised. So get as many people signed up as you can. But the other thing, and probably the most pressing thing now, is that at the same time, see, the UN's not going to ride over the hill and declare Scotland independent. We have to do that. And the really important thing now is to understand ourselves and to explain to as many other people as we can the difference between what decolonisation means. And it means liberation. And that's part of liberation is independence, but that is not all of it. See, Scotland's not a sort of watered down version of England. When we were annexed by the English state, we had our own political system. We had been in existence for almost 1,000 years as a country. We had our own laws, and we had our own very, very distinct constitution, which, by the way, is still there. It's largely still there in law, partly because of the claim of right, which was adopted as a condition of the Union. Of course, that doesn't matter because they threw that all out. But legally, as they say, de jure, the claim of right is still there, and it's still the basis of Scots common law. And it really just rehearsed. You can forget the religious stuff. That was imposed, and it was a feature of its time, and it's no different from the English Bill of Rights. But the constitutional principles on which it was based, those are still there, and they make us very different. Not just different from England, they're part of what gives us a very distinct identity. If we're trying to find our way back to our national identity, that is a really good place to start, because the sovereignty of the people over their government. Now, that doesn't mean getting to vote every 5 years. The sovereignty of the people, as expressed in the claim of right, is the right to sack a government that has violated the compact with the people. Compact is based on the rights of the people. And those are quite extraordinary in Scotland. A friend of mine, a member of Salvo and Liberation, Alex Thorburn, who has enormous, 30 years of working with human rights groups and pushing for human rights, said that when you look at the claim of right in modernized and what it talks, and you see it in modern language, he said it's probably the first iteration that he knows of the fundamental principles of modern human rights. So far from being just a sectarian document to do with Catholics and Protestants, it was in fact, and it was intended to be a pulling together a short version of Scotland's constitution, and it lists the rights of the people, and any government that violates those rights can be removed by the people. That's sovereignty. I mean, it goes on, it continues. It's never handed over to the politicians. They're supposed to be answerable to the people. And that takes you to things like, in the modern world, things like direct democracy. This is very, very distinctly Scottish. Now, isn't that something that, looking at the corruption of the Westminster government, and the lack of effectiveness of the Scottish government and the sellout of things like the free ports and so on, how badly do we need that Scottish principle back in place today, that the people are sovereign, actually and practically, in ways that they can implement sovereign. And the other big principle in the Scottish Constitution is the common good. And that comes from the Scottish people. The Crown of Scotland is still there. It's dormant, but it's still there. And the Crown was never the monarch. It's the community of the realm. It's the people. And the Crown owns the whole of the territory of Scotland. That means the people own it. And that means that we have the right to share in and to be responsible for the resources of our nation. These are very ancient principles, and yet today they're radical. So that's the other thing that we need to start looking at and talking about, what liberation means. It means that when you take the boot off the neck of Scotland, the nation, that nation sits up and it gets back up and it reclaims who and what it is, its constitution, its culture, its languages. You can start with the constitution because that's easy. It's easy to see that. It's easy to say, yes, I'm standing for this. We want this back. What does that look like in the modern world? We don't want to invent a new Scotland that just looks like the old England and the kind of modern Western model that is falling apart. We want to take the best out of the Scottish Constitution, and we want to save our people with it. Scots now, too many Scots are in terrible distress, and it's getting worse. And the injustice and the cruelty and the viciousness of government policy is unspeakable now. And the Scottish Constitution can deliver us from that. So we want to think about not just independence, but liberation. We want people to start thinking about, what can we deliver? What can this offer? Where does liberation take us? And it's a long way, a lot further than the notion of trusting our politicians to do what they promise to do. It's about taking the power and the rights of the people back to the people.
Alf, if I can come back to you, if we look across to countries like Africa right now, we see countries like Burkina Faso throwing off the chains of colonial rule. There might be a queue at the UN's door waiting for countries just like Scotland for their colonisation to be recognised.
Well, as Sara alluded to, back in 1960, Scotland might have joined that queue had we been a bit more familiar with our condition. But yeah, the reality is that the self-determination process of the United Nations is the path to liberation, to decolonisation, to independence. So we shouldn't forget that. What we also have to think about within that context is that pleading with the colonial power, the imperial power, is not the solution. that as the SNP have proved, they've become co-opted into that racket or system, become a colonial administration, and effectively are holding back the independence movement now. So I'll be interested to see what the SNP's response to this initiative is, because, to be honest, it's something that they should have been doing a long time ago. And it's something that I've written about that they should have been doing a long time ago as well. So we have to remember also that self-determination is a right. And it's also an obligation on member states to facilitate that right. So it's an obligation of the United Kingdom and other member states of the UN to help facilitate the right of the Scots to self-determination. And the self-determination process is, as well, it's a matter for the colonized people. It's not a matter for other people, and that's where we get into the idea that, well, the requirement actually by the UN that there should be no external interference in the process. As John alluded to, we had nothing but external interference in the UK managed referendum process of 2014. It was full of external interference, and some observers called that out as well at the time. So yeah, we have to avoid that in future, the external interference, and that's part of the UN process. And we have to see where this goes, because it's an avenue that many other countries, most countries that have achieved independence have gone through, and therefore, if you want independence for your people, the UN is the place to go.
John, what happens if Liberation Scotland is successful? We can't expect the UN to wave a magic wand and declare us an independent country. We have to rely on other things. And one of the things I was thinking about was when Scotland went to the Euros last year, we had this kind of people celebrating Scotland without politics. And they've done a lot of good for Scotland because they alerted a different nation to our country and what we are and what we stand for. This is soft politics. That can help us as well, can't it?
It can, and I think that's key to the diplomatic effort with the UN. But I think how we move forward is we're united. You know, the independence movement, the country, ordinary people, with a common focus, each playing a different part, either domestically or internationally. And ordinary people, as you pointed out, going for a football match, can demonstrate what Scotland has to offer, the value that we have internationally to the world, and it will help our recognition or getting recognition. And as Alpha said, the key is self-determination. Success will not be the UN declaring independence, it will be the people of Scotland democratically deciding that they are independent and starting to build a new state. And what we can do now is unite, focus around the international effort and the domestic effort, and start to prepare for the democratic process of declaring our independence. It sounds simple, but I've got to be a bit vague because it's going to be a longish route. And to gauge success in international terms is recognition, but recognition may come in stages. So we have the opportunity to marshal our resources, our people, ourselves, and get on the march.
We're coming to the end of this podcast, but I've got a couple of questions left. Sara, it was when I started to read my own historical evidence going back to 1707 that I got interested in Scotland's relationship with England. My initial emotion was anger. Do we all have to get a bit angry and get onto the streets?
I think anger will take you so far. I think if you read the truth about the Union and what has happened to Scotland, and over 300 years, it hasn't stopped. It's not just that it happened. It's not just what happened in 1708 when the treaty clearly wasn't going to be put into effect, and the English just imposed English treason law in Scotland. That's an entire kind of thing in itself, as it's utterly different from Scots law, and punitive and feudal and but carrying on, we've lost 4.2 million people. We're not thriving. We have the worst poverty in the UK, where our people have been used as cannon fodder. You start laying it out. We've really begun that exercise of putting these colonial markers, the things that happened to colonies, together. Of course you get angry. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you. A normal person will get angry reading that long history of colonization and the suffering of the people of Scotland under the colonial boot heel. But you can't use anger to take you all the way to the finish line, because anger runs out. It kind of sputters out. If you care, if you want to know, you're a normal human being, do some research, do some reading, you will get angry. And that will take you so far. And then, it's not even get even. It's do something about it. Then it's a cool, clear, objective. We will not stop now. We know what we're dealing with, and we know what we have to do, and then we have to get like that. We have to get absolutely determined to reach that finish line. but you can't, you can only do that if you know what you're dealing with. You can't negotiate a divorce with a kidnapper. You have to organize an escape. So, that's the kind of difference, that once you see it and you've got angry and you've got determined, then you set about going, right, well, we didn't get married and we're in an abusive marriage. We were kidnapped and we're being abused and we're getting out.
Well, here's the thing, Sarah. I got very angry, but look at me now, sitting very calm and collected on this podcast. So I've done something positive with my anger.
Exactly.
I'd like to finish off asking you all to join in with this. And what would you tell Sheriff Azizov? I think that's his name. This is the guy who's been tasked to taking our case to the UN. If he visited Scotland, Alf, what would you say to him? The key things he has to take to the UN on behalf of us. I'll start with you.
Well, I think Sheriff really has things to tell us, because he is aware of the mechanisms that operate within the UN system, and also the resolutions which Scotland particularly needs to be considered under, and therefore I think he has helped point us in the direction of them, and also his conclusion and his agreement with our analysis of Scotland's condition is pretty much confirmed as well. So he is very much on side and knows that he has a very strong case. But I think, yes, he will come to Scotland. He will be made extremely welcome, as everyone is to Scotland. And I'm sure that he will enjoy his time in Scotland amongst the Scots. But I think the Scots will also enjoy our time with him, and including with the UN, as this process goes on, because I think that's also a fundamental aspect of this, working together in that sense to take the initiative forward. It is a new initiative, but it's been one that's time has been coming for quite some period, as we've seen that the UK is intent on blocking Scotland's exit or withdrawal from the UK under all circumstances it can. And this is one area and one forum where people will see that reality and make decisions on that basis.
John, will you be bringing a tin of iron brew and a tonic tea cake to this guy who comes to visit us, or are you past all that? You're wanting to give him something a bit more meatier.
Well, I don't drink iron brew, I drink malt whiskey, but I'm sure you participate. No, I'm sure Sheriff would be welcomed, and I'm sure he would like to come. When I met the team in Geneva, I was quite pleasantly surprised, because it's a team. And one of Sheriff's colleagues actually did a master's in Edinburgh. So they're well tuned into Scotland. And I think that they will make our case very well with the delegations and the member states. Because remember, the case has to be recognised and accepted by the rest of by the international community, and that's no easy feat. But the case is sound, as he's already said, and I look forward to entertaining Sheriff and the team when they visit Edinburgh or Glasgow, somewhere nice.
Sarah, wouldn't it be good if Sheriff came to Glasgow? I'll say Glasgow, but it could be anywhere. But if he came to Glasgow and we had an Irish or Icelandic friends backing us, wouldn't that be advantageous as well?
I think it would be wonderful. I mean, if I was to have my sort of ideal scenario, I would have Sheriff and those states that we have on board, and the supporting lawyers. I think it would be wonderful if we had our Scottish MSPs and MPs come to meet them. If we could get them all to sit down, because I think they're, Sheriff is very impressive.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the the sight of the international support that Scotland really has, and the legal support that we have for the case, is impressive. And apart from the fact that I think the whole JPTI team would love spending a bit of time in Scotland, I think the ideal use of that time would be to begin educating our sadly uneducated political establishment in Scotland. They were willing to have the humility to listen, to learn something that they don't know. They think they already know. They don't know. And then we might see the beginning of a united front. Because as John said, at some point, you know, we're going to need those politicians, and it would be much easier to have some that are already there in place rather than have to create a movement to elect a whole new, you know, set of politicians. So
100,000 Scots welcoming this guy and him having to give a speech, and we all listened intently to him. I think that'd be magic.
it would. It really would.
Listen, thanks very much, everybody, for watching this podcast. If you want to find out more, go to the websites liberation.scot, salvo.scot, and you'll find out more. But really, you have to immerse yourself in the history of Scotland, and you've got to get talking to each other, because to make this podcast useful, we all need to come together. And with that, I'll say goodbye.